Stangibelisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1, Good Vibrations. I have a little story to tell you of childhood memories from my ham radio early days. Childhood meaning 17 years old. It was the summer of 1971. The exact date, in fact, June 24th, 1971. A date that will live, well, if not in infamy, at least it's stamped onto my memory. I had a vertical antenna back then for 20 meters, a quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna. The radials were laid down on the roof of my parents' house in Rochester, Minnesota. There was a big elm tree in the front yard, a backyard with retaining walls, and we did a lot of things back then. Myself, my friends and I, we played wiffle ball and did all sorts of things back there, but I am amazed at what my dad let me get away with, and my mother, back in those days. I had 52 radials of a quarter wavelength each on 20 meters laid down in a circular pattern on that roof. And except for the fact that the roof, of course, was a little bit peaked, it was pretty nearly level. The antenna itself was cut to resonance and made out of 2 telescoping sections of steel conduit, electrical conduit, the sort that you run electrical wiring through. I wanted that thing to be strong. It was guyed at the 10-foot level by means of nylon rope and clamped to the center with a hose clamp and some insulating electrical tape to keep the hose clamp from cutting into the nylon rope. I had a Drake T4X and R4A in the fallout shelter of my parents' house. That was called the lab. That was where I did all my ham radio stuff. The thing was fed with RG8U coax. And it actually ran through the house, through the attic, and up through a hole. No, I didn't cut a hole in the roof. I ran that cable. Well, yes, I did cut a hole in the roof. Please pardon my hoarseness. It's one of the side effects of Cipro, that beloved antibiotic that I'm on, and that's giving me such a bellyache. In any case, that thing was standing there on June 24th, 1971, and early in the afternoon my mother asked me, "What do you think the weather's going to do today, Stan?" Because back then I sort of had an extrasensory perception, a clairvoyance, a predictive ability, like an animal kind of the weather. I've since lost that ability, but I simply said, "Severe thunderstorm." And indeed it was. At about 5 o'clock p.m. on June 24th, 1971, a gigantic thunderstorm bore down on the town of Rochester, Minnesota, and wind gusts kicked up, and I knew it was going to be a bad one right then. Before the rain started, I ran out into the backyard, up the stairs to maybe the second or third deck where the retaining walls were, to see how my antenna was faring in that wind. And it was hardly moving at all. The trees were already beginning to rip apart, branches flying through the air, the sky ominously dark, incredibly dark shade of gray for an afternoon in June. The wind roaring through the trees, and I knew it was a tremendously powerful wind, but the backyard was somewhat sheltered, so it didn't blow me over. Otherwise, it would have. It would have knocked me off my feet. It had the EF2 or even EF3 tornado category strength. But that antenna was just standing there, ignoring it all, because it was made of steel conduit, actually, after all. We went down, and we stood by the front door of the house where there were some windows and watched the wind blow against that elm tree. Roaring wind. We watched the trees across the street in our neighbor's yard. One of them blew down in 3 sections. Wham! And then a few minutes later, wham! And then a few minutes later, another wham! Maybe 30 to 45 minutes of powerful wind battered the town of Rochester, Minnesota, and then it was gone, but the sky remained gray. We turned on the radio to see what kind of news might be on about the storm, and there was all kinds of, they were having a big conference. It sounded like a very busy news conference room, people talking all over the place, and someone with an English accent said winds in the city gusted to over 100 miles an hour. Well, back then, to me that was a lot of wind, but there was no damage to my antenna whatsoever. Lots of other antennas were blown down. All kinds of tree damage was done in the town, some structural damage too. But that was my vertical antenna for 20 meters, a ground plane, indestructible. I doubt that even 150 mile an hour wind could have knocked that thing down. I doubt that even Hurricane Andrew would have blown that antenna over. It might have blown the house out from underneath the antenna, but the antenna was indestructible, because those were my specifications in those days. As we watched that storm, I stood in my swim coach's gym shorts. I was training very hard that summer between my junior and senior year in high school, spending half my time on the Drake radios and half my time in the swimming pool, unheated outdoors, at Soldiers Field. That was the name of the pool. I wanted to be an Olympic swimmer. Came nowhere near that. But I did rise somewhat to the heights in ham radio, ultimately becoming a W1AW operator and a member of the staff of the headquarters at the American Radio Relay League from 1977 to early 1979. Just a few years later, it was only about 8 years, only about 6 years later, seems like just yesterday sometimes, we had windstorms in Rochester, Minnesota, and we had a vertical antenna that none of them could destroy. The Stangibelisco ground plane antenna. W1GV now is my call sign, good vibrations, and I will say 73 for now, and so long, which, back then as now, in my native fist, translated and translates to da-da-da-da-da-da.